Corporation of the Arab Republic of Egypt. We have also Mr. Sanjeev Gupta, the Executive Director for Financial Services, the Africa Finance Corporation. Dr. Yang He, the Manager of Modern Finance Research Institute from ICBC. Mr. Todd Wilcox, the Deputy Chair and CEO of HSBC Egypt. And Dr. Mohamed Farid, the Chairman of the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt. I'm delighted to have such wonderful panelists, and I will be joining them on the panel very, very shortly. I am Jean-Paul Adam, and I am the Director for Policy, Advocacy and Monitoring at the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa to the United Nations Secretary General. And I have spent most of my career working either in the Seychelles government or in the UN, working on these issues of resource mobilization and in terms of mobilizing innovative finance, in particular in the developing world. I am obviously speaking more from an African perspective, but we will hear from our panelists also how to apply this in the context of the developing world more generally. We are obviously in an era of great uncertainty. We are faced with conflicts, the difficulty of recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, while also having to achieve one of the most monumental investments in humanity, which is represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. We are off track in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we are unfortunately off track also in terms of achieving climate resilience, with current levels of warming leading us to well above 2 degrees of warming, which will be catastrophic in terms of the impact on communities. So in today's session, we will be hearing about the challenge of mobilizing finance, of resource mobilization, but also some of the potential solutions, some which have already been applied, and some of which we would like to see in the conversation that is happening on the reform of the international financing architecture. And in the questions that we will exchange with the panelists, we hope to find answers based on practice, based on concrete examples, using the practice of investing in the developing world, and also looking forward as to how to mobilize those additional resources. To give you some examples from the African context, 2 very distinct challenges. Obviously, in Africa, to achieve the acceleration that we need to invest massively in renewable energy. But over the last 2 decades, only 2% of global investment in renewables have gone to Africa. Similarly, we need to mobilize the private sector, and a lot of the conversation that we'll be having is how to deliver blended finance in a way that allows the public sector to lead, but the private sector to deliver. And in the African context, only 14% of climate finance is currently coming from the private sector. And this compares unfavorably with the rest of the world. Even in Southeast Asia, it is above 30%, while obviously in the developed world, it is in excess of 80%. So we look forward to this discussion, and after these brief words of introduction, I will be proceeding directly to the panelists. And thank you all for being with us. We look forward to a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. So, ministers and distinguished panelists, welcome once again. We are delighted to have this conversation, and we will, as much as possible, be going relatively rapidly through some rounds of questions and also giving a chance for the audience to share some questions and some thoughts with us as well towards the end, if time permits. And I would like to start our discussion by going to Mr. Sanjeev Gupta, the Executive Director for Financial Services at the Africa Finance Corporation. So Sanjeev, from your perspective, what's the starting point for us to deliver green investment in Africa? what works and what doesn't work. I think we want to hear examples of the good and the bad. Share with us those ideas, and let's focus on what are the ways that we can upscale the good things and get rid of the bad. I'd like to ask each panelist to try to remain within about 4 minutes, but please, Sanjeev, over to you.
Thank you, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for choosing me to start the discussions. I wasn't expecting it, but I know that there was a last-minute conspiracy on part of one of the panelists, and here I am. I think this whole issue of green transition, green investments, green energy in the African context is an interesting one, and I'll tell you why. I mean, we all know that Africa as a continent generates very little of the carbon emissions that currently plagues the world, less than 3%. But Africa as a continent, because pollution has no borders, is affected disproportionately by the effects of climate change. So that's why, as AFC, when we develop and invest in infrastructure or energy projects on the continent, issues of climate, resiliency, loss mitigation, protecting livelihoods is embedded in our investment process. It's not something we started doing recently. It's just the way we have been doing business because of the way we want to manage risk. So given that sort of backdrop, what I would really like to highlight to everybody is that there is a real fear on the African continent that the development agenda, if you want to call it, or certainly the energy agenda in terms of providing access to energy to the African continent, has a very real risk of being overtaken by the green agenda. And I think we have to be very careful about that, because in Africa, the green agenda has to somehow merge into the energy agenda, and the energy agenda has to somehow merge into the bigger development agenda, right? Because it is no secret that, like everything else, the continent is blessed with huge amounts of solar, wind, geothermal, hydro resources. As a matter of fact, I think reports say that 70 to 80% of the renewable resources reside on the continent and is untapped. So it is a no-brainer to use the resources that God has given us. But you know that Africa has an energy crisis. And why is that so? It is because inherently the continent has not managed to industrialize and provide the base demand for energy projects to be viable. So going green is not going to change that equation. And that is why my plea to my audience here and the markets out there is, don't look at the green agenda in isolation, because there is opportunities. We are doing a lot of work in it, but embrace it within the overall global agenda of reducing global shipping, which is a big source of emissions, diversifying supply chains out of China, or Asia for that matter, and somehow make sure that rather than continuing with extracting minerals out of Africa, start producing value-added industries, which gives the industrial base for energy projects to basically be commercially viable. So I'll give you one small example, 30 seconds. We recently commissioned a wind power project in Djibouti. Djibouti is this small little land in the Horn of Africa, and it had no electricity. It was basically supplied by heavy fuel oil generators. And as you know, Djibouti is a port that through which runs 30% of global shipping. So we went in and we realized that there is a real demand for it, and there is a supply from the wind side of things. And we developed that project from scratch, 60 megawatts, 2 years flat, delivered it, commissioned it. So the bottom line to what I'm saying, sir, is there is good things happening on the green transition. There's good things happening in terms of bringing climate resiliency into our infrastructure projects. But somehow let's merge that into the overall industrialization agenda, because otherwise the commercial viability will always be challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the detailed response. Very quickly, a 30-second follow-up from you. Have you found the green agenda sometimes a block for investment?
No, I haven't actually found it a block, because, you know, the green agenda fits into so much of what our own priorities are. And green agenda, in theory at least, is providing funding. In theory, I'm saying it because, as you know, pledges haven't been followed up on. But in theory, that's a pocket of capital that attracts us. So to me, it's not a block. It's something we do for a living. It's important for the communities we serve. Because please remember, sir, that today the climate change in the world affects Africans disproportionately in terms of livelihoods, in terms of crops they grow, in terms of mobility, because people depend on rivers and streams for mobility sometimes. So for us, it's a real issue, and therefore the green agenda is welcome. It's not a block at all.
Excellent. And as you were saying, we have to merge these agendas. So then that's how we're going to deliver a more comprehensive result. I'd like to move now to Dr. Yang He, the manager of Modern Finance Research Institute at ICBC. And we know that China is an example of a country that has successfully mobilized significant resources for green investment. Can you share with us some examples in relation to resource mobilization strategies and methods which have been deployed?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would like to share you a green finance project that ICBC is involved in. As many know that currently the Asian Games is now being held in Hangzhou, China. You know, Hangzhou is a beautiful country known for its Chinese-style gardens. And building and operating infrastructure for Asian Games in a city like this calls for an emphasis on environmental protection. We observe that the Chinese government attaches great importance to the provision of regulations and having published relevant guidelines as early as 2018. And these guidelines place environmental requirements on the design, construction, and operation of infrastructure. Concerning resource mobilization, the Chinese government have contributed 20% of the initial capital for the project, thus enhancing governmental credibility. After the initial project construction, various financial institutions, including ICBC, have combined forces to form a syndicated loan to provide project financing, while policy banks or policy guarantors are also being introduced to minimize the risk of the loan default. And with regard to financing guarantees, it has been calculated that the Asian Games made a positive impact on the local economy, and particularly with the efficient operation of the private sector, which bring an expectation of profit. So that's why public sectors and financial institutions work together on revenue financing and applied it for sports venues, securitization of transportation facilities, and trademark financing. So in summary, addressing climate change needs infrastructure to be eco-friendly and to use economic terms, and compared to the conventional infrastructure, the modern infrastructures, while commercially profitable, should also generate positive externalities. I mean, especially in relation to climate change. That positive externalities could be derived from government provision of regulations, policies, and standards, thereby maximizing societal well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very good to hear about how the link between the public and the private sector has been instrumental to deliver these results. And I think we're going to hear a bit more about this as we proceed in our panel discussion. I'm going to go now directly to Mr. Todd Wilcox, the Deputy Chair and CEO of HSBC Egypt. And how, from your perspective, does a global bank such as HSBC engage in delivering sustainable finance adapted to local needs in developing countries? And I think one of the particular thoughts is, how are you involved in SMEs? How do you deliver finance, for example, to the smallest actors?
Okay, thank you. And what I'll do is I'll bring it from macro to micro and talk a little bit about HSBC globally and then what we're doing here. And it really shows, I think, that it needs to be a local implementation in any country that you're in. So as a group, we've committed to taking our entire portfolio, so us as a bank and our supply chain, to net zero by 2030, and our institution at a portfolio level for all our clients to net zero by 2050. And what that means is really moving our pipeline of lending and our whole portfolio and transition quite quickly. And if you look at the different countries we operate in, and we operate in 40 plus countries, every country has its own targets and its own approach and its own transition plans. To bring it to Egypt and a little bit about where this works, we're quite engaged in some very big projects, and Noafi, which I'm sure we'll speak about at some point, but at that level, at some of the hydrogen projects that have been announced during COP27, I'm getting my COPs mixed up now, COP27, and that we're engaged, because many of our clients are engaged in those projects, and very big multinationals, and you need some very large corporates and very large kind of dollars to be able to take some of those on. But where we also see opportunity is throughout the whole economic chain. And just to use a little bit of, I'll use two examples where I've been quite proud of what's happened. If we go back, this is a bit of an old story, but when I was at COP26 in Glasgow, I met a company there that takes recycled plastics, and they take 1.6 billion in recycled plastic bottles out of the Mediterranean and out of the market on an annual basis, reducing carbon for production of those plastic bottles by 85%. And they take those recycled plastic bottles and recycle them back into food-grade plastics. And because of that, they can sell the plastic at a premium, and they're selling it to other big multinationals who have a commitment to reduce their environmental footprint. So the company is public, is Barrick. They are now looking at expanding regionally and expanding their operation. But a very good example of a business that has really taken advantage of large multinationals such as Nestle, L'Oreal, who have targets to hit that will pay a premium. And Barrick was the only company in the region that was able to do that and had the technology. And we financed an expansion of their operation. And I'm quite proud of that. And that was just something from a conversation at COP26. But the demands of the net zero movement is creating new business opportunities. And I think as a bank, we need to be in front of those business opportunities. The other one that came out of the last COP was SHIFT EV. And you would have seen them in the lobby here. And I'm very proud of this one as well. That we met them, and what they do is they take the Suzuki vans that you see all through Egypt, and overnight, they will convert them to EV. And the engineering to do so is really where they've got the edge, and they've spent a lot of time on the engineering and the production facilities. And we finance them. They're one of the first companies that we put through our new tech lending program. The bank as a whole is committed to $1 billion into green tech. We're doing our part for that. And Shift EV, we financed, and we've also started introducing them now to our other multinational clients who have a need to reduce their carbon footprint. And those are clients like Amazon, who have a big delivery fleet. And that's a market too now that they can go cross-border. So Shift EV, talking to businesses in UAE and in Saudi. So for me, those are good examples where it's the whole chain. Everybody's moving in the same direction. It could be very macro, huge scale projects, or you can get your local clients that are really moving. And I think the role of the bank is to really facilitate that at all levels, but also to introduce people to each other so everybody benefits.
Thank you very much, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about Noafi later on, but I think it's very interesting to see that the revolution that we need needs to happen at every level. So we need these large-scale projects such as Noafi, government-led, but we also need to deliver this in terms of the day-to-day businesses that are connecting to populations, that are providing business services to populations, whether it's transportation or similar products that are necessary for life in the modern world. I'd now like to move to Dr. Mohammed Farid, the chairman of the Financial Regulatory Authority. Dr. Farid, so how does regulation and domestic legal framework work to stimulate investments in sustainable development? And in particular, how do we account for climate risk? Does the rise in climate risk increase the cost of capital for developing countries? And should we rather be able to reward positive climate investment with more affordable access to capital?
Well, the question is quite complex because everything runs around or boils down to regulatory frameworks. I believe the starting point for assessing regulatory frameworks and the importance, of course, of regulatory frameworks to ensure or to foster and increase investments in the green space would be information and data. We can be speaking about specific projects. We have here heard some specific projects that we are trying to link, or that there has been efforts to link them with other private sector players and so on and so forth. However, if we didn't manage to move from a project-based financing to a mainstream financing, then we're not going to achieve the 2030, 2050, whatever targets we are going to put on ourselves on an annual basis, and to miss on an annual basis these targets in terms of investments being driven to or being directed towards green infrastructure, green investments, and so on and so forth. This is not going to be materialized unless we manage to move from just a project-based finance to a mainstream finance when it comes to green investments and sustainable investments. And to achieve this point, you need to have data, and you need to have disclosures, and you need to have information. And that's why one of the most important regulatory frameworks that has been adopted in Egypt and recently, and because of COP26 and the ISSB, I don't know if we are aware of it, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, issued the two sets of regulatory frameworks or reporting frameworks. IFRS S1, which is Sustainability 1, talking about the frameworks of reporting on sustainability and environment. And then we have IFRS S2, which talks about specific disclosures pertinent to carbon emissions, carbon footprints, and so on and so forth. And hence, these type of these type of frameworks unified a bundle of, I would say, letters and frameworks from UN Global Compact Framework for Reporting, from TCFD reporting framework on disclosures pertinent to the financial sector, on GRI reporting framework. So we had a myriad of abbreviations covering the reporting frameworks that everyone didn't know what to follow. In Egypt, we opted for example, the TCFD at the non-bank financial sector. For you who don't know, the FRA, the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt, is the one governing in terms of prudential regulatory frameworks and conduct all non-bank financial services. So for the non-bank financial services, we opted for the TCFD reporting framework, which has been developed by Bloomberg Philanthropy. For example, the banking sector, they opted for the GRI. For the ones that are listed, would have to report on GRI and TCFD. But hopefully, with the IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, and at a point of time, we are going to adopt them in Egypt, this is going to be implemented. And the benefit of IFRS S1 and S2 in terms of data, that it is not only pertinent to the financial sector disclosures or listed company disclosures, it is sector-wide. So basically, this would be a nationwide reporting framework for sustainability and carbon information and carbon footprints. So the starting point to move and to make it mandatory, these types of information and disclosures, would alleviate the possibility of the banking sector to be able to finance specific projects for mitigation and hopefully at a point of time for adaptation. So this is one point. It is the information and data to be availed. The second point, any type of project would require financing, a sort of financing. Without having a developed, I would say, regulatory framework that would avail green bonds, blue bonds, brown bonds, which is the transition bonds for particular projects, sustainability bonds at large, and not only those types of bonds, but as well specific type of funds. So, for example, nowadays we just issued a couple of regulatory frameworks and amendments to the executive regulations of the capital market law of Egypt that whereby you can be labeling explicitly that your fund is a green fund or a sustainable fund if you abide by a certain set of regulatory frameworks. Why is this important? If we're talking about the main topic of the session, blended finance, availing financing from DFIs and obtaining finance from philanthropic institutions, the best way for them is to work through a regulated framework, and the best way for them to operate is to be seeing reporting requirements being implemented, having the assessment of those types of investments that they are still abiding by the frameworks pertinent to sustainability or green emissions, and to ensure that if in effect this investment had its impact on reducing I would say the carbon emissions or whatever. So having these types of regulatory frameworks accompanied by the disclosures and the data is the starting point, and that's why we have seen the ISSB, which is a subcommittee or a sub-entity of the IFRS, responsible for all auditing and reporting requirements and standards globally. To be issuing these types of standards was of paramount importance for everyone to be able to do it. And from I wear another hat, being the vice chairman of IOSCO, and even the IOSCO endorsed these new reporting standards on sustainability, and there were plenty of discussions because it's very much understandable that I would say size matters. So you cannot be requesting, you cannot be requesting a company with a very small capital to be to abide by the same reporting requirements when it comes to the carbon footprint, and so the issue of proportionality has been tackled in the IFRS or the ISSB S1 sustainability standards 2, actually, not 1. And this point is again good for emerging markets and frontier markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you saw I did not want to cut him off because it was so fascinating. And I could have this discussion for a long period, but we have got a lot of ground to cover. But I think the key takeaway there is that the framework must allow this predictability of finance, because without the framework, we're essentially doing projects, and there has to be a system, and the system is dependent on the regulations. So thank you so much, Dr. Farid. I now have the great pleasure to go to our host, Minister Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister for International Cooperation of the Arab Republic of Egypt. And we are all delighted to be back here with you in Sharm El Sheikh, where as part of the work of the COP27 presidency, you launched the Sharm El Sheikh guidebook for just financing, which for those of you who have not seen it, here it is. And I think which has played a key role in, I would say, shaping the Egyptian presidency, but also ensuring that finance is top of the agenda for climate. Because if we are not solving the finance equation, we will not solve the climate equation. So in this guidebook outlines some of the ways in which sustainable finance can be upscaled for developing countries, included through blended finance, for example, and other innovative finance, including debt swaps. So from Egypt's experience, what are the key solutions to deliver sustainable finance? And maybe also what is still missing?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back. And first, let me start by commending you personally on the work you've done, whether it's in Seychelles or UNICA, and also your work with us ahead of COP, because it helped very much shape the conversation in a very practical way. And the whole point is how to move from policy to practice. And the only way to do that is by looking at this panel and seeing the different backgrounds of those who are involved in this discussion. It's a multi-stakeholder engagement. You need the government, and I asked to speak last so that the role of state is less, but governments need to be there, regulatory authorities need to be there for standardization, the private sector needs to be there, institutions that provide guarantees or technical assistance, and also banks. So and of course there are more stakeholders that need to be involved. Philanthropy was mentioned, MDBs and so forth. So in order to move forward on any climate agenda, finance is extremely important, but finance has certain requirements. What we try to do is to put a definition for just. The word just is extremely important because the climate transition, I don't only want to call them energy transition, because we have sustainable transport and we have many other pointers, is very much in a way that does not create a trade-off between the development pathways of countries and their climate ambitions. This is an extremely important background, and that's why the concept of just came forefront in our discussions. This COP was a COP of implementation, but how can you actually implement? We need to make sure that the quality and quantity of financing is available, and the word that is used, given the UN language, leaving no one behind. And leaving no one behind means that if we're looking at skilling, at jobs, etc., we should keep these trade-offs into account. Another very important aspect, we just came from New York, and in New York there were two very important consecutive summits, the SDG summit followed by the Climate Ambition Summit. And this doesn't come as a coincidence because today everybody, each and every country is trying to show from a public policy point of view that you're pushing on the development pathways. And also on the international and global stage, you cannot push your development and find finance unless it's green finance. And that's why the two are very much intertwined. And the message that has been repeated is how can we show in action, in practice, that all the projects Todd mentioned and all the regulations that Mohammed Farid mentioned are consistent in a way that ensure that we are meeting the SDG goals, but also meeting the climate goals that countries are putting forth. So these are all very important discussions in the policy framework. Now, how can this translate? And you mentioned the concept of going from framework, or instead of focusing on individual projects, you have to have a framework to be able to channel the investment or the finance in a proper way. And let me say that the discussions we're having today in the global fora about revamping the international financial architecture, rethinking how MDBs should increase their concessional finance, how to bring in private capital or philanthropic capital as a catalyst. All of these discussions I wish we had in 2019 because it would have equipped us today to all these consecutive shocks that are happening. But they're better late than never. I think there's a lot of goodwill, and the level of discussions have improved over time. I mean, most recently now in discussions, policymakers and MDBs, everybody's talking about the macro risk. They're talking about the FX risk. We're talking about the credit risk. All of these are real risks that affect what the banks want to do, what the private sector want to do, and also make blended finance more meaningful, because we can keep on saying blended finance, but if the risks are still too high, even with an element of concessionality, the degree of risk might deter those from entering the market. Now, you asked about Egypt specifically, and let me say that in the preparation for COP27, creating a framework for our green transition came in the language of long-term strategies, the LTSs. Countries need to do the LTS, which should be consistent with the NDCs. For those in the room, I'm sure everybody knows, but NDCs are naturally determined contributions. All of this lingo we all got very accustomed to last year, and this was an important exercise because it's very, very important that all these concepts become very well known across ministries in a government, across private sector with UN Compact, across the regulators that are supposed to put the benchmarks to be able to put all of this into effect. So anyway, Egypt put together its country climate strategy 2050. This included projects related to sustainable transport, green hydrogen, renewable energy, water desalination, food systems, biodiversity when it comes to protecting the natural resources of Egypt. So it's a very ambitious 2050 plan. What we did in this plan is we linked the SDGs to climate action and to the NDCs. So it's a blueprint of where the country wants to go in 2050. And then we started to choose priority projects for COP27 and created the platform, the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy, which we're very proud that many of our partners here are a part of. But it boils down to 3 key words: commitment. Government is committed to moving forward on its NDCs, to move forward on its climate ambition. Number 2, clarity with projects, very succinct projects. And in this platform, the preparation for projects, the technical advisory in terms of doing the feasibility studies, partnering with GFANs, partnering with IRENA, etc. So, to be able to leverage on the many instruments and tools that are provided by different institutions is very, very important for policy making. Governments need to be aware of this. And this information gap is something that we also try to overcome or try to highlight in the guidebook for just financing. The 3rd C is credibility. We have had projects since 2014. Bin Ban yesterday was featured in the opening. And when we talk about the first renewable energy big project in Egypt, in order to mobilize the financing, the government had to take a regulatory reform, the feed-in tariff. Once that happened, you unlocked potential. Concessional finance came not for the government, but for the private sector. And we have many partners, including AIIB, that actually finance private sector companies for renewable energy. So the credibility that the government has, the credibility when it comes to regulation, the credibility with respect to engagement with the private sector on some of these very important renewable, be it wind, be it solar, be it water waste management, sanitation, etc. All of these are trying to meet the NDC. So commitment, clarity, credibility, and then trying to always leverage the many initiatives that exist. And one of the key items, each and every institution today is trying to fill in a shortcoming that exists, be it technical advice, be it capacity building, partnering with other institutions to increase the financing. We need to be aware of this. And I think institutions such as the UN, institutions, platforms that we create also within the African Union, all of these initiatives need to be clarified and communicated. Finally, you mentioned debt swaps. We did in our NOEFI platform on the energy pillar a debt swap with Germany for 100 million euros. This is extremely important because it shows today everybody's talking about debt for nature swaps. How can we alleviate the risk? How can we alleviate the FX exposure? So debt swaps are extremely important, and this is a debt swap in the mitigation area because it's related to our energy pillar of NOAFI. But again, very symbolic, very important, and it avails or unlocks the first part of the energy pillar, which is decommissioning the plants which use gas and move into renewable. So I can go on for a very long time. This is a work of 24 months, but I will spare everybody and leave it for Q&A. But just as conclusion, governments need to be innovative, tap on what exists. Sometimes people say, why do you keep on, engaging in so many fora and traveling and so forth? But that really opens up accessibility to the different tools and the different narrative, which today, and I go back to what Mohammed mentioned, is extremely important, that mainstreaming these concepts into our policy dialogue and into the multi-stakeholder engagement becomes extremely important, because then it's not unfamiliar and we are able to tap, do more blending, do more engaging more philanthropic capital into the beginning of a project where we need patient capital or sunken costs that could be covered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think the 3 C's are very strong messages for us to take away. Strong government commitment. Governments must lead the process because they set the priorities, long-term strategies. This provides an anchor which also attracts private capital. But in the immediate challenge, we do need to use innovation, blended finance to get that capital mobilized. And I think the debt swap aspect is particularly important for Africa because African debt is rising hugely and has risen hugely also partly as a result of COVID. And if we don't create that immediate fiscal space, we're going to be standing still. So thank you for those great examples. We're going to have another round of questions before we come to the audience, and I will ask panelists that we can be relatively short, so we'll have that time. We're a little bit over time, but we can still make this work, I think. So Sanjeev, you started us off, I think, very successfully. Thank you so much for doing that. But we do tend to paint a picture around investment of finance in Africa as being something coming from outside, right? But as you said, there are things that are already happening within Africa, and there are African institutions that are leading. But from your perspective, why is it not happening routinely? Why is there not more intra-investment? Why are there not more African institutions investing in this green revolution?
Yeah, so you asked us to be quick. I don't know how quick I can be with that question, but I'll try. So, you know, I think we have to accept one basic fact in life, and that is that charity does begin at home, right? It doesn't begin elsewhere. And capital, by its very nature, is always fickle, right? It always looks for the Goldilocks solution, right? And Africa has suffered because it has either been seen to be too hot or too cold, but never warm enough, right? So that's the realities in which we operate. So, you know, since we are talking domestic capital or African capital, and we're also talking innovation, let me give you an example of how both works together. So AFC, the institution I represent, is actually a creation by African governments and African private sector getting together and saying that we need to mobilize African capital to work for Africa first before we get in global capital. So we were given $1 billion 16 years back by African governments and African private sector and told, go and develop projects in the industrial space, in the infrastructure space in Africa. That capital has grown to $3.5 billion now of domestic African capital. What has it done? It has successfully developed and de-risked projects that allowed global capital to come in. So for the $3 billion that we have got as domestic capital, we have leveraged against that. So we have a leverage of another $10 billion in our balance sheet. And that $13 billion has attracted another $40 to $50 billion of investments into Africa. So it's what you call bounce for your buck and leveraging of what you have. So ours is an example of innovation, and ours is also an example of how you can look into sourcing scarce domestic African capital to work for you in the space that global capital won't work in, and leverage of that. I don't know whether I've got 2 more minutes to give one or two examples of innovation. Again, talking about domestic capital, and in that theme then, one of the things we have recently been doing and very successfully is because we are rated A3 by Moody's. So we are the 3rd best rated institution on the continent. And we realize that both African governments and African private sector has shortage of foreign exchange, and they can't go to the markets, as we know. So we have been systematically giving credit enhancement programs to governments and the private sector for them to be able to then tap into capital markets at an affordable price, right? So that's, again, another way that domestic capital, in a way, is attracting global capital. Third quick example is around something we have done on the climate side, where we have set up a climate resilience fund. The idea is that that fund will invest in the resiliency element of infrastructure projects. Again, going back to the Goldilocks example, global capital will not come unless commercial objectives are met. So what we have done is we have created a first loss layer, which we will take along with the Green Climate Fund, on the back of which global capital will come. I can go on, but essentially the point I'm making is, for us, necessity is the mother of invention, and if there is a problem, we have to find a solution to it. And that's how we are trying to be innovative and mobilize the capital we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Really great examples, you know, building on the local to bring in more foreign capital and then using that for the priorities. Dr. Yang He, we're going to you in terms of, give us some ideas on what does ICBC see as the essential factors to support innovative financing for green infrastructure projects?
Yeah, thank you for your question. To some extent, an excellent bank is certainly a balanced bank. So the same applied for innovative financing. There's need to be a balance between a commercial profitability and safety. Let me cite another case that ICBC is involved in. In attempt to evaluate Jordan's energy shortage, ICBC provided financial support for the largest new type of power plant in Jordan. We have cooperated multilaterally with the World Bank and others to design a diversified financing and capital structure, which is effectively an exercise of credit enhancement. It thus has lowered the project financing costs and increased the tenure of the financial support. In fact, this approach brings safety benefits as well. First, it's leveraged project management experience of multilateral institutions to effectively increase the risk analysis capacity at the project's early period through joint reviews and other methods. Secondly, it enhances the risk management capacity of the bank consortium through some mechanism like multilateral investment guarantee agency mechanism. Thirdly, it boosts information symmetry and thereby the risk control capacity during the project loan period. And as a result, the project was hugely successful and won the award for Best Gas Power Project of the Year, voted by professional medias. Thank you very much. Short answer.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And I think particularly we see how the de-risking aspect is brought in, and that is critical for the success of in this space, and links us very well with the idea on how we can deploy blended finance. Todd, going back to you. You spoke about NWAFI before. The minister has also spoke about NWAFI. What are the factors that make such an ambitious project viable and attractive for financing? And I have a follow-up, if you can cover it in a short time. I'm putting you under pressure here. But we know that Egypt also issued its maiden green bond in 2021. And are such vehicles likely to continue to be an effective vehicle for sustainable financing?
Boy, the NWAFI is actually quite easy. And talking about clarity and commitment, I remember, I'll talk about Her Excellency, got a group of us in a room, and we very much, it was a situation where if you want to be at the table, a player at the table, you had to be there early, right? And as a global bank and being committed, we needed to be there up front. And we got our GFANS colleagues involved. And I would say it's complicated. And I think your team, you and your team, Your Excellency, did a great job pulling us together, and it crystallized into those projects very, very quickly. Now, putting those projects all together and getting the funding behind them and the structure is the more complicated part, but at least we all know where we're going. And that clarity, and I think on the regulatory side as well, makes it easier as a bank to do that long-term commitment because we know the rules of the game and we know the project well and we know everybody is committed against them. So while it's not easy to do, it certainly sets the ground so that we can all start making headway. And I think we're quite involved in the energy sector with EBRD. I shouldn't say the AIIB conference, but the role of those multilateral development banks is really, really important to help take some of the bumps out of the road. So I think that we've done this globally with some JETP structures in Indonesia, Vietnam. I think banks work best when we've got, in this space particularly, when we've got partners that look at risk a little bit differently than we do. So we just did something with Temasek in Singapore called Pentagreen, which is a joint venture where we just funded a solar farm in Philippines. So I think these projects push the banks farther than they've been pushed in the past, but I think it's important for us to be at the table or we'll be obsolete into the future. And I think we'll be obsolete because I was at a dinner, the Minister of Finance isn't here, so I can tell the story without getting in trouble. I was at a dinner with him 2 years ago with investors in London, and the question came up about the green bond offering. And the minister was grumbling a little bit, and he does grumble about the fact that he thought green pricing would be lower. And one of the people at the table said, no, not green pricing will be higher. And soon everything will be green because the investors have that requirement as well. So the whole market is starting to cascade in this direction. And I think it's just a matter of time before the regulatory framework really requires every instrument and every investment to be assessed against the new standards.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we look forward to the day where everything is green. And we're working towards that. So Dr. Mohammed Farid, we know that the Financial Regulatory Authority has played a key role in the development of the market for carbon credits in Egypt. So how do you see this as a potential vehicle for Africa, for example? And what are the critical ingredients to upscale?
Okay, carbon markets are quite complex. I don't think I can be brief about it. So if they want to understand what carbon markets are and how we move,
I need to ask you to try
to develop this, I'll do my best. And to be honest, you'll still be in trouble talking about the Ministry of Finance and the bonds that they have been issued and the grumbling regarding the pricing. But maybe a very brief comment. I do agree 100% that at a point of time, if you're not abiding by and you're not implementing all the requirements to be green and sustainable, you will not be part of the financing game. You will just be detached and not be present in the financing formula globally. When it comes to carbon credits, I'll take from what Sanjeev has been saying. It is about commercialization and return. In Egypt, in 2014, what jump-started green investments in Egypt and sustainable investments and renewable investments was the feed-in tariff. Why was it the case? Feed-in tariff created a very clear path for the returns of those investments, as Dr. Rania mentioned earlier. So feed-in tariff made, basically jump-started the investments in the renewable energy in Egypt. Commercialization is the key point. Without creating returns for investments, even if it is green and sustainable and takes care of the youngsters and it ticks all the 17 boxes of the Sustainable Development Goals, if the return is not sufficient, still no one, apart from philanthropy here, but no one will be investing in that area. So it is to complement things being sustainable, but it's not about replacing return being sustainable. So that's step number one, or that's the first point. Carbon credits is about being a sweetener and a teaser for investment. It creates more return for investments in the green space. How is it the case? Starting point, you need to create an idea of a project that would reduce carbon emissions or would do carbon sequestration, which is basically taking the carbon and putting it into the ground so that your cultivating land is much better and soil is much better in terms of its ingredients and nutrients in the soil. And after having the idea, you need to have what is called a verification and validation bodies. These are the entities, the verification bodies that would come and say, according to the UNFCCC methodologies of evaluating projects, and every single sector have a different methodology. This methodology of this project would result in a carbon reduction. And then comes the validation. So you have the verification and then you have the validation process. The validation process would come after implementing those particular investments and would come and say, yes, effectively when I measured the carbon emissions of this factory, of this farm, whatever it is indeed that the carbon footprint or the carbon dioxide has been reduced by a certain amount. And after finishing all of these processes, you come and have registries. So far, you don't have regulated registries, and that's whereby we intervened and issued the regulatory frameworks for local and international VV bodies to be operating in Egypt, and this was one key component. But before that, we needed to consider carbon credits as a financial instrument. Why does the Financial Regulatory Authority regulate those types of markets? You have two dimensions or scholars here. One, according to the European Union and that area would be that carbon credits is a financial instrument. In the US, it is considered a commodity. It's not considered a financial instrument. And hence, you would find in the US, CFTC is the one regulating the carbon credits as opposed to ESMA in the European Union and the likes. So here we opted for for that carbon credits is a financial instrument. Then we issued the regulatory frameworks to list verification and validation bodies. And then we had to look into what does it require to have a verification and validation bodies. It turned out to be 3 types of ISO certifications: ISO 14065, ISO 13064, and ISO 17030-something, 36. And then it turned out that EJAC, that is in Egypt, does not have these ISO certifications. So we sent them basically a formal letter that you need to ask for them, and they got it last June in Egypt. And hence we paved the way for any person or company that is willing to be a verification and validation body, because this is the bottleneck to see an immense increase in carbon credits. The cost of verifying and validating the projects to come and issue, I would say, carbon credits and to be put in the well-known registries of VERA, Gold Standard, GCC, and so on and so, or the American Carbon Registry, and so on and so forth, is very expensive for this part of the world. So without having locally developed VV bodies, it would be impossible for, I would say, having a clear growth in that area. But it doesn't have to be a local. As you rightly mentioned, Africa, in terms of emissions, represent, what, 3.6% globally, all in all. So if you're going to have local carbon markets separate than the entire continent, you will have very fragmented markets that is not yielding the, I would say, the efficiency that we would be hoping for. And hence, part of the efforts, it was an African Carbon Market Initiative, and ACME with the Economic Commission of Africa, is to gather and aggregate all the VV bodies in Africa and to have this registry as the common registry across the entire African continent. And then you get to feed it from local, I would say, verification and validation bodies. And once you, and by the way, as well, local registries. It doesn't have to be the 3 big registries that are there, but as well, we need to put, and we are finalizing this as we speak, the framework to register or to license local registries for carbon credits to be issued and traded. And what afterwards? The moment you have the entire infrastructure from players, supply side, which is the projects, and in fact, we have some projects that do have carbon registries at the VERA registry. Some of them are BIMBAN and so on and so forth. Once you have the supply side, the demand side, and now we've heard HSBC that they want to abide by and achieve the targets, so they will have to buy in this carbon credits once they are up and running. And then you have the final point for the carbon markets, which would be the auctioning and the trading system. This is what we envisage, what we have issued already from having a verification validation bodies regulatory framework, what is going to be issued very soon regarding local registries to be up and running, because we have some local registries that turned out to be okay. And then we will leave the pricing to be an auctioning system, so everyone would be bidding for the price of this particular carbon credit, whether it is registered in international market, in international registry, sorry, or the local ones, and to see if they are really mean business, so they will bid high tickets for those carbon credits. Yes?
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think we particularly note it's a sweetener that makes a lot of projects feasible. And I think this is very important. And the bottleneck of verification and validation, which needs to be solved at the continent, and the solution should be continental. Let's get the scale. Thank you so much. And I would like to now have our final part of the panel discussion with Minister Rania. And we know that Nwafi is a successful example of resource mobilization at scale in transformative investments for climate resilience and in infrastructure in Egypt. So how was blended finance deployed in this regard? And how can this initiative be replicated?
Well, let me start first on the replication side, and here comes the point that you know, when we're discussing why can't we move from pledges to implementation, the excuse is always there's so much supply of money, but there are not enough projects, and countries don't have a pipeline, and if they have a pipeline, they don't have the technical expertise. So you go through a long menu of it just won't work, but there's so much money on the sidelines, and I think what is very important for countries, as I mentioned, is have these long-term strategies or try to create projects which are going to address their nationally determined contributions. And then the second point is make these available in some way. I just want to go back to when Todd said he would not mention the EBRD because we're at AIIB. I want to say no, that MDBs, particularly in our case, work in a coordinated fashion, and that's very much needed, so that the concessional element, rather than having it from one institution, you can have it from more. The project that was mentioned yesterday on the screen, which is the Abu Qir metro in Alexandria, this is co-financed AIIB and EBRD, and it's sustainable transport. So it reduces CO2 emissions, and it's an example of trying to achieve national goals in line with the global goals. So this is just to say that coordinated and more work between the IFIs or the MDBs, whatever name we're going to call them, is very, very important. On the blended side, and this is where on the energy pillar, for instance, so Nouafi has an energy pillar, a food pillar, and a water pillar. On the energy pillar, we were able to secure concessional finance, EBRD, German government, a grant component from several of our bilateral friends in Europe. And the idea is that the private sector that's going to come in, and many of these contracts have already been signed, can also secure this concessional finance. So this is one element. If I look at the food component with the World Bank and IFAD, there's also a very important grant component which is coming in order to also create this opportunity for private sector. We have our colleagues from FAO here as well, and really on the food pillar, there are inherent expertise to be able to bring in the private sector. There's a concept which says, or a perception, that private sector doesn't come into resilience projects or adaptation projects. And what the guidebook, and I invite everybody to, it's on the website as well, and we have some extra copies, where we have examples from Africa where the private sector has come in and actually contributed to food projects or adaptation projects. The other important aspect that we provide here is for each capital provider, there's a map that shows how much risk they take and how much is the return on investment, because this is also sometimes information. If it's AFC, or if it's an MDB, or if it's philanthropy, or if it's commercial bank, I mean, what is the risk and what is the return? So we also try to show this here, so that as we are designing our structure of the project, we are able to know in terms of quantification the return versus risk that is available for each one, and then give a compelling argument when we're designing the project. We plan to go to COP28 to showcase what we've done in 12 months. For those who are at COP27, we had put everybody in a room. Sorry, Todd, it was a crowded room. But we had demonstrated the partnerships with different development partners, bilateral and multilateral. And we spent really, and I commend the team at the Ministry of International Cooperation, coordinating across government and across partners to ensure that at each step there's full transparency on the process itself. It's a lot of work. There are 9 projects, but each project involves many parties. And it's very, very important that there's consistency, there's transparency and accountability. And this is another very important point. We believe very much in country ownership. We believe in inclusive partnerships. There's accountability and transparency, but also we need to be driven by results. So as we go to COP28, we'll have the same session with the same partners, but instead of just the signing, everyone will get on stage and explain exactly what they have done with respect to the project. So I invite everybody to attend our session, and we'll hopefully live stream it at COP28 to basically show the results from Nouafi. And this is the only way to make it convincing that it's replicable as well. And this is a responsibility that we've taken on ourselves as well as with our partners who are working with us on this platform. And Nouafi in Arabic means fulfilling pledges. So we always say, let's Nouafi together, let's fulfill pledges together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this excellent example of implementation. And I think particularly also in how the the roles of of the government was very clear as the leading entity, but ensuring that this brought in the financiers as well as the private sector. So we have a few minutes. Unfortunately, we'll only be able to take about 3 questions or comments. Can we raise hands so that I can see? So we have one over there, please. Please introduce yourself and then your question or your comment. And if I could ask people to remain within about 30 seconds, so because we want to hear the takeaways from the panelists as well.
Thank you so much. My name is Zoa Abdulmonem, Ahram Online, a journalist from Egypt. The World Economic Forum estimated the infrastructure gap at $15 trillion through 2040. Do we have, my question for Dr. Rania, do we have a specific estimation of this gap in Egypt in particular and in Africa in general? My second question is for the whole panelists on the stage. The African continent is suffering a very challenging time because of so many reasons, because of the already existing implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. The climate challenge, the climate threat, and the geopolitical tensions in Europe. So what are the most important types of these innovative finances are required for the continent to pushing forward their SDGs agendas? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I see one hand in the front. Is that correct? No? Okay, I think, Minister, maybe you could respond. And then if there are
in terms of the gap, you know, there are so many estimates out there. And with the implications of the war and the cost of raw materials and solar panels and all of that, the cost keeps on going up. So we do know there is a sizable gap in Africa. In the case of Egypt, and I invite everybody to take a look at the 2050 country climate strategy, because there you have a list of projects across sectors and there's a costing for them. So this is also very important information that was made public. This was in June 22. What we try to do as a ministry, which is designated from the Egyptian government, to try and avail concessional finance to be able to fill in the gap for several projects. If you take a look at the portfolio with our partners, at any point in time, it's close to $26 billion. We did on our website a mapping of each dollar of official development assistance to the SDGs. So the SDGs that got the biggest concessional finance were SDG 7 with renewable energy. The second one was water sanitation, SDG 6. And then SDG 9, which had to do with infrastructure and innovation. So it really maps very nicely, the objectives. But also, if I look at all the financing that went to SDG 13, climate action, you will find that it's close to 12 billion, 8 to mitigation and 3 to adaptation. So again, this shows the split globally, that more of the concessional finance is going to mitigation compared to adaptation. But again, we try to document this. The information is on the website. But in terms of quantifying the gap, all we know, it's in the north of trillions. So it's a big gap globally. And Africa particularly, it's quite big because also the work that's needed, whether it's in the energy transition or adaptation, is quite sizable. So the idea is, how can we, bring all the money that is lying somewhere or claimed to be, and try and bring in capital investments as well.
Yes, maybe I just too quickly to add, unfortunately I don't have the figure, but the United Nations Environment Programme does publish a report on the gap. So I can send you the link for that. I think the last figures would be from 21, from the report of 22. Is there another question?
Sorry.
Yes.
There was a second question on the funding.
Please go ahead.
Do you mind if I...
No, please go ahead.
So I agree that funding is a challenge, and we all know the reasons. And I think we'll do well to remember that there is a basic construct issue here. And the construct issue is the way the global architecture on manufacturing and trading currently operates. It essentially bypasses Africa, right? And for us, that is the systemic challenge that we have to grapple with and deal with. Because as I said, capital is capital. Capital will come when capital wants to come, right? And I always say that capital reacts to 3 emotions, either fear, greed, or guilt. So guilt hasn't done anything for Africa. Greed sometimes has, but exploitatively so. So the fear element is what I think we need to work on. And when I say the fear, I mean that the climate agenda itself and the need for diversifying supply chains, access to critical minerals should be a fearful factor. The other aspect is global shipping and how you reduce it and therefore manufacture at source, where Africa should be the solution, and how you use renewable energy to manufacture, where Africa has renewable sources. And finally, the fear factor, I think, will come from the sheer need to combat extremism, immigration, and everything else that's happening. So if you can combine all that into a narrative and therefore project the image that invest in Africa for your own fears or your own needs, then capital will come. And we are seeing a momentum geopolitically because of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have one last question. Please be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Good afternoon. My name is Nyasha Mutengwa from the World Food Programme. And my question is addressed to Minister Rania. First, congratulations on the success of the NUEFI. The question we often get from MDBs as the United Nations is to see how we can work and support governments to be able to develop bankable projects that can be financed. And one of the greatest challenges that MDBs, such as AIIB and others, are facing is the pipeline of projects that they can finance. You designed and mobilized resources for NUEFI in probably the record time. And I wanted to know what were some of the key success factors and what ingredients did you put in the pot to be able to deliver at such a record time, but also a program that's credible and something that many African countries and other developing countries globally can learn from. Thank you.
Well, I think the key is that there was, since 2014, a very clear vision and focus on what we need to do when it comes to water waste management projects, when it comes to sustainable transport, when it comes to social programs, education, etc. So there was a very clear vision then, and this was translated very quickly into projects. Of course, countries are very different in terms of capabilities and technical expertise and so forth. In our case, the work that has happened in the past has created an inherent experience across technical ministries. So when we are discussing with the AIIB, we know exactly that we need this in this sector, in that sector. If we're working with the African Development Bank, the same. So there's what we need on the fringes is sometimes doing the feasibility study, making sure that the projects are consistent. And there's a lot of scope for South-South cooperation. And what we are doing now with some of the countries in the continent is also working with them on what we did, for instance, with respect to silos. We have a mission coming over from countries in Africa to see how we increased our storage capacity for wheat in one of the developmental projects, which was also financed through development finance and development cooperation. So these are real examples. There's a scope for South-South cooperation. The AIIB can act as a platform for that. The World Bank today, with its evolution, is looking more into that and more into regional integration. And one final thing is that when we do all these projects, we need to label them as global public goods. They are not just for Egypt, but they are for Egypt to serve the global goals. Because now there's a very big debate. We're all going to Marrakesh for the World Bank meetings. And what is does the global public good concept come in contradiction with country ownership? And the answer should be no, they should not. But we should be very clear on how we define and show that they're consistent.
Thank you so much. I think our panelists have been excellent. We would have the chance for our panelists to give me, unfortunately we are at time, but I would ask the panelists in 30 seconds to tell me what is the priority that they would, unfortunately we just don't have time. I'm really sorry if there was another question because I'm going to be in trouble. But I would, what I would suggest is that after we can perhaps have a quick exchange. I would ask each panelist to give me their priority takeaway to unlock finance.
Okay, I would be very brief. We need multilateral cooperation from government, banks, and international institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we need to move faster on what we talk about when it comes to reforming the international financial architecture. Very good ideas, but let's just move into action.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The move to action is important. I guess for us as well, that iterative learning that we need to keep going through to be able to deliver on some of these targets.
We need to know what we're talking about. I mean, we keep giving ideas, we keep talking about very big issues, but without really knowing the details of it and how complex it is. So my piece of advice, or my, I would say, bottom line here, we need to really know what we're talking about. We need to study how to develop it further, and this is going to happen. It's not something that we have the luxury of not doing.
So from my side, there is a saying that united we stand and divided we fall. And to me, there is a dire need for African governments and African financial institutions to collectively close ranks and create an African narrative, an African bargaining position around these issues. That's the only way difference will come. It will not come through a fragmented approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to really thank our panelists, and I would just summarize a few very brief takeaways. One, the commitment of, I think Minister Rania used this word very effectively, the commitment, the plan, the direction, the strategy. That is an anchoring tool which helps to bring investment. Secondly, the regulatory governance frameworks need to be in place to make this happen. Thirdly, how to bring in the private sector. Governments cannot do it alone. And fourthly, we need to deal with some of the immediate obstacles. It may be debt, in some cases it might be the regulatory framework, but these are elements that have to be addressed to allow finance to flow at scale and tackle the urgency of the climate crisis and accelerate the SDGs. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Minister Rania, for hosting us and for showing such leadership. And thank you once again to all the panelists.